The year is 1869. The place is the American frontier, a geographical term that masked a devastating socio-political reality. This was not the frontier of romantic myth. This was the vacuum of the Reconstruction era, a wild, fractured territory where the rule of law was not absent, but simply privatized, owned, and weaponized by those with the most ruthless initiative. It is a period often sanitized by historians, but when you peel back the layers of sanitized text, you find moments of absolute, brutal clarity. Moments where the math of warfare was defied by the geometry of sheer, impossible defiance. We are here to analyze one such event, a forgotten skirmish that historians often omit because it does not fit the clean narrative of expanding federal control. We call it the Vance Protocol. The initial confrontation defies all statistical modeling. 37 armed men, members of the locally infamous paramilitary known as the Regulators of the Red River, entered the valley with explicit orders: secure the target, seize the assets, and eliminate any resistance. They were highly experienced veterans, self-appointed enforcers of the local corrupted infrastructure. They had tactical superiority, overwhelming numbers, and the implicit legal cover of a county judge who had been successfully intimidated into compliance. They were operating with absolute impunity. Their target was Elias Vance, a man who, by all public measures, was nothing more than an independent settler, a father, standing alone on his acreage. He possessed no private army, no established political connections, and no discernible military force beyond his own hands and a single, well-maintained long rifle. 37 men entered the perimeter on a Tuesday morning. Less than 6 hours later, forensic reconstruction suggests 29 of those men had been neutralized. The remaining 8 had abandoned their mission, their equipment, and their dignity, fleeing into the chaparral in a state of professional and psychological collapse. The Regulators of the Red River's initial strike force had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting unit. Statistically, the probability of a single isolated individual surviving, let alone inflicting such devastating lopsided casualties against a professionally trained and numerically superior force, is effectively zero. This outcome only becomes possible when you introduce a variable that the predictive models cannot account for. A man who understood asymmetry not merely as a concept, but as a discipline. To understand the mathematics of this impossibility, we must first reconstruct the environment, the powder keg ready to ignite. The late 1860s were defined by a profound lack of legitimate authority. Federal power was distant, exhausted, and distracted. This legal and physical vacuum was quickly filled by self-styled militias and vigilante groups, organizations that initially promised order, but quickly devolved into tools for localized, systematic oppression. The Regulators of the Red River were the quintessential example of this infrastructure of terror. They were not common bandits. They wore uniforms, they operated with military precision, and they used the law as a shield, leveraging corrupt local officials, the prototypical Reconstruction-era scalawags and opportunists, to sanction their seizures and executions. Their modus operandi was calculated psychological warfare. They didn't just seize land, they destroyed hope. They sought to enforce an absolute disparity of power, ensuring that anyone who dared to question their authority was publicly and brutally broken. Their arrogance was born of an unbroken chain of successful intimidation. They believed they were untouchable, the inevitable consequence of a failed political system. Elias Vance was targeted not because he was rich, but because he was uncompromising. He was a man of quiet, ironclad principle who refused to capitulate to their demands. Demands related to the spurious seizure of timber rights and, critically, the alleged debt collection tied to his youngest son, an elaborate legal mechanism designed purely to force Vance off his profitable land. For the Regulators, eliminating Vance was not just a business transaction, it was a necessary display of force required to maintain their systemic control over the entire county. They sent the 37 men with the explicit instruction to bring Vance back alive for a public trial, a predictable piece of theater, or, if he resisted, to simply leave his remains as a warning. They did not anticipate resistance. They anticipated compliance followed by a theatrical execution. The first sign that this was not going to be a routine operation was the silence. Forensic analysis conducted decades later, piecing together fragmented journals, official county reports that were later suppressed, and the disturbing layout of the abandoned homestead, reveals that the regulators, confident in their numerical advantage, spread out to execute a standard flanking maneuver. They approached the isolated cabin from 3 distinct vectors, assuming Vance would either barricade himself or attempt a panicked escape. He did neither. The investigators who eventually pieced together this puzzle noted a specific, chilling detail. The targets, the first regulator flank, were not scattered. They were neutralized within a compact 30-yard radius of a specific copse of cedar trees, suggesting that they were taken out not by a chaotic barrage, but by highly disciplined targeted fire from a fixed, concealed position. The autopsy reports, which were later meticulously filed away as unverified rumors, universally suggested immediate incapacitation. There was no widespread firefight. There was only an execution of tactical efficiency. The regulators, used to dealing with scared farmers and isolated civilians, suddenly found themselves confronted by something entirely different. They were hunting a target they believed to be weak, but they had instead stumbled into a carefully prepared kill zone executed by a professional soldier. The hunter had instantly become the prey. This transition from certainty to profound, paralyzing terror is the true inflection point of the Vance protocol. When the lead flanking unit failed to respond to the signaling horns, the second wave, commanded by Sergeant Major Silas Thorne, advanced cautiously. Thorne's journal, found years later partially submerged in the muddy creek bed, a testament to his hurried retreat, ends mid-sentence. The darkness is absolute. No smoke, no sound of struggle, only. The remaining page is blank, torn off by the Sergeant Major as he realized his error and fled. We rarely get to witness such primal, psychological shock captured in the historical record. Most history is written by the victors, cleaned up for polite society. But sometimes, if you have the patience to scour the forgotten archives and the stomach for the unvarnished truth, the psychological carnage leaps off the page. This is the kind of analysis that separates mere historical documentation from true investigative reconstruction. If you find yourself compelled by the mechanics of this forgotten conflict, you might consider subscribing to this channel. There is much more that has been deliberately erased. What Thorne and the surviving 8 men witnessed was not a firefight, but a correction. Elias Vance was not just a father. He was a ghost from the recent conflict, a highly trained combat veteran who had evidently spent the preceding days preparing his farm as a tactical fortress. The surgical nature of the defense was confirmed by the evidence left behind. The abandoned horses found miles away, strangely placid, but tethered to nothing. The unused ammunition stores found inside the cabin. The total absence of structural damage to the Vance property. This was not a desperate stand. This was a calculated, silent excision of an invading force. Vance operated outside the emotional parameters of fear or panic. He treated the militia exactly as one would treat an operational threat in a high-risk environment. The 8 survivors fled, abandoning their wounded and dying, not because they were overwhelmed by return fire, but because they were overwhelmed by the chilling realization that their opponent was invisible, flawless, and utterly ruthless in his defense. They had encountered a superior weapon. They brought back word not of a successful engagement, but of a disaster, a massacre orchestrated by a single man who moved with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. This humiliation was intolerable. For the regulators, whose power structure depended entirely on the appearance of invincibility, this single act of defiance had punctured the entire socio-political balloon of their dominance. They could not retreat. They could not accept this loss. They were compelled by the very infrastructure of terror they had built to escalate immediately and overwhelmingly. The consequence of Elias Vance's perfect defense was not peace. It was the immediate guarantee of total war. The regulators, now blinded by vengeance and existential dread, began mobilizing every available resource. They called upon their allies in neighboring counties, demanding reinforcements, swelling their numbers into the hundreds, preparing to descend upon the Vance farm not to capture a man, but to obliterate a symbol. They sought to erase the proof that their system of oppression was, in fact, fragile. But what the regulators did not yet realize was that the message of Elias Vance's terrifying efficiency had traveled faster than their mobilization. That single impossible defense had resonated far beyond the valley. It had reached the ears of those who had also fought in the recent war, veterans who understood the geometry of that kind of lethal professionalism. These were men who had been waiting for a sign, an undeniable indicator that resistance was not only possible but professionally viable. Elias Vance's action was the trigger. It was the signal that galvanized the latent, powerful forces of true justice that lay dormant across the demoralized frontier. The lone defense of a father against 37 men was the catalyst that brought the long-awaited response. The regulators were mobilizing their army, preparing for their final overwhelming act of vengeance. But in doing so, they were unwittingly painting a massive target on their own backs, summoning the very force that had quietly sworn an oath to dismantle them. 100 veterans who understood exactly what Elias Vance had done and what needed to be done next. The history books omit this chapter because it demonstrates a terrifying principle, that systems of systemic oppression can be fundamentally broken, not by grand political movements, but by singular acts of perfect, tactical defiance. The regulators prepared for a siege. They would soon receive a correction. The legend was about to be written. The political geography of the American frontier in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War was not defined by lines on a map, but by the gravitational pull of localized, absolute power. The specific year of 1869 falls precisely within the most volatile phase of Reconstruction, a period that witnessed the collapse of existing judicial infrastructure and its replacement, in numerous remote territories, by an infrastructure of terror. We are not discussing random bandits here. The antagonists in this scenario were not merely a posse. They were a self-appointed quasi-military organization, sanctioned, either explicitly or through convenient negligence, by elements of the newly formed state governments eager to re-establish social order along deeply prejudiced lines. They operated with the institutional confidence of official law enforcement, meaning they were meticulous, documented, and absolutely ruthless when calculating costs versus benefits. Their target, the man whose singular defiance would ignite this regional conflagration, was, statistically speaking, negligible. A single former Union veteran, residing on hardscrabble land with his family. The initial dispute, we recall, was centered on a matter of property rights, engineered and manipulated by powerful local interests keen to consolidate land ownership through intimidation rather than negotiation. The militia's role was to be the final, silent guarantor of this socio-economic coercion. When the organizational leadership authorized the permanent removal of this family, they did so based on cold probability. Their assessment, found later in fragments of internal memoranda recovered from a burnt-out county courthouse, calculated a 98% chance of immediate compliance or swift flight. The remaining 2% accounted for the possibility of violence, but even that violence was projected to be disorganized, easily contained and quickly neutralized, concluding with a perfunctory inquest and the inevitable burial of the troublesome farmer. The absolute disparity of power was meant to be the psychological weapon. The militia had access to better rifles, better horses, and critically, a network of intelligence that ensured they knew every trail, every contact, and every weakness of their target. They didn't just patrol the valley, they owned the concept of mobility within it. Yet this system of oppression, so finely tuned to crush dissent, made a fundamental, fatal error of underestimation. They focused entirely on the statistical profile of the target, a man weary from 4 years of conflict, now tasked with rebuilding a life in the economic depression of the post-war South, and failed entirely to account for the unique anomaly of his training and temperament. This target, let us call him Elias for simplicity, though the records of his regiment offer a far more complex history, did not panic. He did not appeal. When the initial intimidation attempts transitioned from subtle threats to overt surveillance and harassment, Elias executed a calculated pivot that instantly threw the militia's tactical assumptions into disarray. He chose defiance, but not the defiant stand of a martyr. This was the defiance of a specialist preparing a defensive perimeter. The militia's primary tactic was psychological siege. They would send small reconnaissance teams, no more than 3 heavily armed men, often rotating shifts, to simply be visible near his property. This constant, chilling presence was intended to erode sleep, drain resources, and force the target into a desperate mistake. But the field reports from the reconnaissance teams began to show inconsistencies. The expected signs of breakdown, hasty packing, excessive consumption of alcohol, bursts of desperate, ill-aimed gunfire, never materialized. Instead, the militia observed clinical preparation. Fence lines were systematically reinforced, not with crude wire, but with strategically placed interlocking obstacles designed to funnel cavalry toward specific choke points. The family's small log cabin, previously a simple domicile, was suddenly and quietly transformed into a hardened defensive position. Window shutters were not merely closed. They were strengthened with internal bracing capable of defeating standard rifle caliber rounds at medium range. The shift was noted in the militia's operational log. Target is exhibiting unusual competence in military engineering fundamentals. Advise immediate increase in surveillance assets and reconsideration of immediate close quarters engagement. This sudden awareness of the militia's increasing scrutiny is where the historical investigation truly begins to yield unsettling insights. The narratives recorded by the surviving elements of the militia later downplayed this phase, preferring to portray the eventual confrontation as a sudden, inexplicable disaster. But the documentation tells a different story, a slow, dawning realization of dread. One particular piece of sensory evidence recovered decades later from a dry creek bed near the contested property provides a crucial window into the psychological transformation. A surveillance notebook, waterlogged but partially legible. The author, identified only by the initials JR, was one of the rotating surveillance assets assigned to Elias's perimeter. The entries start confidently. Target family remains isolated. No supply runs, waiting for exhaustion to set in. The entries transition slowly to unease. Saw the target moving timber not for firewood but heavy sleepers. Too methodical for a civilian. Moves like a sergeant major. Then, a sudden, chilling termination. Dawn patrol encountered unexpected impediment near the South Ridge. Small rock slide, professionally triggered. We had mapped that route as clear. The target is not defending. He is mining the field. Fear the final word is illegible. Abruptly ending mid-sentence, the remainder of the page smeared by water damage and perhaps something else. It stands as a stark testament to the moment the psychological advantage shifted entirely. The militia believed they were the hunters operating in a controlled environment. They began to realize dimly that they were now simply intruders in a carefully constructed kill zone. This type of granular analysis, sifting through the institutional lies and the faded paper trails of forgotten skirmishes to reconstruct the moment certainty collapsed into terror, is often too complex, too demanding of sustained attention for conventional historical accounts. If you have the stomach for the truth that was deliberately erased from the official narratives of the Reconstruction, consider joining us. The escalation continued. Impatience began to override procedure. The leadership, sensing their carefully managed intimidation campaign was failing, decided to ratchet up the pressure. They authorized the deployment of a larger contingent, 2 full squads, totaling 33 men, armed with the most modern weaponry available to them, including repeating rifles acquired through back-channel Reconstruction-era procurement systems. This deployment was not intended as the final assault, but as a show of overwhelming force, a psychological hammer blow meant to break Elias's will and secure the property without excessive bloodshed, which would require tedious paperwork. But Elias, the anomaly, had been waiting for the commitment of this larger force. He understood the mathematics of conflict better than his adversaries. He knew that the militia's arrogance would mandate a visible, consolidated troop movement, and he knew exactly how and when to contact the network. The historical record suggests that the call for aid was not a desperate plea, but a terse coded notification sent via a prearranged runner, a relic of wartime logistics protocols maintained in secret across the fractured states. The message was simple, immediate, and directed to a specific network of former comrades, the veterans of his old regiment, men who had fought beside him from the wilderness to Appomattox, bound by a unique and unbreakable loyalty forged in the worst crucible of American history. The narrative often focuses on the sheer number, the 100 veterans who responded, but the critical factor was the speed and the discreetness of their response. These were not farmers or local sheriffs. They were highly trained, battle-hardened professionals, many of whom had spent the post-war years struggling to adapt to civilian life, often feeling alienated and underutilized. The call to defend a brother against an illegitimate force, particularly a force symbolizing the oppression they had fought against, was not a burden. It was a reactivation of purpose. Their mobilization was executed with the same surgical efficiency that had characterized their best movements during the war. They converged from multiple states, arriving not in loud, organized columns but in small, dispersed cells, moving silently by night, leveraging the geography they knew intimately, and avoiding every established road and crossing point monitored by the militia network. The stage was set for an unprecedented tactical confrontation. On one side, a 33-man militia contingent, convinced of their systemic authority, now occupying a perimeter around the target's property, focused entirely on the small, fortified cabin. They were the apex predators, secure in their command of the terrain. On the other side, one man inside the fortified structure, displaying impossible calmness, acting as the deliberate bait, and converging silently through the surrounding forested ridges. 100 ghosts of the Union Army, veterans moving like shadows, utilizing fieldcraft that the localized, static militia forces could not even comprehend. The antagonists were not prepared for war. They were prepared for an execution. Elias and his incoming reinforcements were prepared for the dismantling of a system, executed with clinical precision. The militia leaders, resting confidently in their temporary command post several miles from Elias's perimeter, only concerned themselves with logistics and the imminent final assault. They believed they held the clock. They believed the initiative was theirs. They failed to realize that the moment they committed their full force, they had ceded both the clock and the initiative to the man they had attempted to corner. They were about to learn that overwhelming statistical power means nothing when the opposing force is a perfectly engineered counter-anomaly. The system of oppression was about to meet its tactical executioner, and the silence before the purge was deafening. The convergence of forces in the valley was not merely a clash of arms, it was the abrupt collision of two irreconcilable philosophies regarding post-war governance and justice. On one side stood the apparatus of systemic failure, represented by the hastily assembled, federally sanctioned yet locally corrupted militia, a hybrid posse primarily concerned with maintaining the infrastructure of terror that defined the early Reconstruction-era frontier. They operated with the confidence derived from absolute disparity of power, accustomed to confronting isolated homesteaders or fragmented groups of dispossessed dissidents. Their actions were predictable, their formations sloppy, their reliance on brute intimidation absolute. On the other side, however, stood an anomaly. 100 professional killers, disguised as farmers and tradesmen, whose collective experience in kinetic application of force was staggering. These were not vigilantes driven by temporary rage. They were veterans whose discipline was forged in the fire pits of the Civil War's bloodiest campaigns. They moved not as a mob seeking vengeance, but as a surgical instrument seeking to perform an inevitable correction. The shift in dynamics began subtly, perhaps too subtly for the arrogant posse to register immediately. As the posse moved deeper into the designated territory, the rolling, forested tracks flanking the river where the aggrieved father's property lay, they started hitting an intellectual wall. They expected resistance at the main ingress points. They found none. They expected panicked warnings. They encountered only silence, an unnatural, suffocating quiet that historical analysts later categorized as the primary psychological weapon deployed by the veterans. This calculated silence was the first sign that this engagement would not conform to the established rules of frontier conflict. The veterans, under the implied command structure of their shared experience, had ceded the posse the tactical high ground, encouraging them to spread thin, to overextend their supply lines, and critically to foster a false sense of security. They were not defending a position, they were drawing lines of interdiction within the labyrinthine topography. We must understand the psychology of the militia force here. They were largely comprised of men who had leveraged the chaotic socio-political landscape of the time, operating with de facto impunity against those without legal or political recourse. Their identity was tied to their ability to inflict fear openly and unilaterally. When that power dynamic was reversed, when the fear began to emanate not from their actions, but from the void they were entering, their cohesion started to fray. The initial neutralization events were not dramatic gun battles, they were disappearances. Forensic reconstruction decades later, piecing together fragmented journals, local rumors, and the specific calibers of non-standard ammunition found embedded in ancient trees, paints a chilling picture of tactical precision. The veterans had utilized the terrain expertly, establishing overlapping fields of fire from concealed positions. Their objective was not annihilation, but disorientation and strategic incapacitation of leadership and communication assets. Imagine the posse riders moving along a narrow, dust-choked track. Suddenly, the rider second in line, perhaps a lieutenant or the most vocal member, simply falls silent from his saddle. No accompanying rifle crack, no visible smoke, just a clean, instantaneous collapse. The psychological impact of such clinical removal is exponentially greater than a sustained firefight. It suggests omniscience. It suggests they are being hunted by ghosts who possess superior technology, or more terrifyingly, superior skill. The ammunition evidence supports this hypothesis. Researchers recovered specialized, custom-loaded rounds designed for maximum stability and terminal effect at extended ranges. A signature of expert marksmen, not a panicked defensive force. The targets were neutralized with surgical efficiency. Autopsy reports, albeit delayed and highly localized reports often suppressed by local authorities anxious to erase the incident, suggest immediate incapacitation of the central nervous system. There was no opportunity for alarm, no chance for the traditional frontier standoff. The posse's operational integrity dissolved under this sustained psychological assault. They began to suspect every shadow, every shift in the wind. The arrogance that defined their initial advance curdled into paranoia. They started turning on each other, accusing members of poor scouting or, in desperation, of outright treason. The infrastructure of terror they had so carefully cultivated for their victims was now being systematically applied to themselves. The records are fragmented because the survivors, what few there were, had every incentive to remain silent, to bury the sheer, unforgiving humiliation of being dismantled by a force they vastly underestimated. But sometimes, the Earth retains echoes of violence that defy official erasure. Our investigative team, utilizing proprietary historical methodology, managed to cross-reference multiple overlooked archival entries relating to recovered materials near the primary confrontation zones. One particularly revealing piece of evidence illuminates the posse's abrupt descent into panic. A small, leather-bound daybook, belonging to a man identified only as Deputy TM, recovered years later partially submerged in a stagnant creek bed. The water damage obscured much of the text, but the final, legible entry scrawled furiously, ends mid-sentence. "They are not fighting us. They are hunting. I hear the quiet, J." The entry breaks off suddenly, conclusively. The evidence suggests that Deputy TM was not killed while writing. He was writing frantically during a moment of supposed safety, the silence itself being the immediate precursor to his end. That level of detail, the sudden truncated fear documented in the solitude of a man's personal record, is what transforms this incident from a mere frontier skirmish into a profound study of asymmetrical warfare. It is precisely these kinds of minute psychological details, often obscured by official narratives and the convenience of generalized history, that truly unlock the mechanism of past events. If this kind of deep, unforgiving analysis, dissecting the true mechanisms of power and resistance on the American frontier, is the history you have the stomach for, then subscribing to this channel ensures you never miss the evidence that was deliberately erased from the textbooks. The posse's situation had become tactically untenable within 48 hours of crossing the initial boundary. Their attempts to deploy standard flanking maneuvers were met with disciplined counter-interdiction, resulting in further immediate losses. The veterans had mapped the terrain with the precision of engineers preparing for a siege, utilizing local knowledge the posse lacked completely. It wasn't just rifles either. The veterans, drawing on their unique skill set, deployed a subtle form of area denial. Archaeological digs confirmed the presence of deliberately placed rudimentary tripwires and signaling devices, not crude booby traps designed to maim, but sophisticated mechanisms designed to channel the enemy movement into predetermined kill zones, or simply to alert the veterans to precise ingress paths during the hours of darkness. The entire territory had become hostile infrastructure. By the dawn of the third day, the systemic failure of the posse was total. Their morale was shattered. They were scattered, low on rations, and crucially, realizing that they were not merely outnumbered, but fundamentally outclassed. The shift had occurred. The representatives of the oppressive system were now the isolated, terrified figures clinging to the desperate hope of retreat. They were no longer the hunters. They were prey being managed by seasoned trackers. The unique anomaly, The collective will and sheer professional skill of these 100 veterans defending the essential human right of a father had effectively neutralized the systemic threat before the mass engagement even began. What remained was the inevitable cleanup, the final, swift application of force required to dismantle the remainder of the fractured entity. The posse leader, identified through surviving accounts as a former local administrator with a reputation for brutality, made the fatal decision to consolidate his remaining forces in a defensible clearing known locally as the Widow's Stand. He sought refuge not in strategy but in proximity, clinging to the outdated notion that sheer density of numbers could somehow repel the silent, precise terror that was consuming his command piece by piece. He was wrong. He was facing men who understood that a centralized target, while seemingly secure, offers the most efficient solution for tactical elimination. The stage was set not for a battle, but for a swift, overwhelming surgical expurgation. The posse thought they were preparing a defense. The veterans knew they were merely organizing the targets for the final kinetic correction that was about to unfold, and the silence of the valley was about to be broken by the grim finality of history. The convergence of forces in the valley was not merely a skirmish, it was a kinetic correction, a brutal statistical anomaly that permanently altered the socio-political landscape of the Reconstruction frontier. By the evening of the third day, when the main body of the county posse, the self-styled Iron Brigade of the South Fork, finally encountered the perimeter established by the 100 disciplined veterans, the outcome was mathematically predetermined. The posse, arrogant and bloated on the easy subjugation of isolated farmers, had brought approximately 150 fighters, believing they were executing a necessary purge. They were walking directly into an ambush formulated by minds honed on Petersburg and Shiloh. The Iron Brigade, financed by opportunistic carpetbaggers and operating with the tacit immunity granted by a collapsing federal oversight, represented the infrastructure of terror. Their method was attrition, intimidation, arson, and then, if resistance was mounted, overwhelming force. Their collective arrogance stemmed from the knowledge that no organized resistance had lasted longer than a single volley in the past 2 years. They expected frightened farmers, not a compact professional fighting force moving with the efficiency of a highly trained regiment. What they met was a wall of sustained, controlled fire. Not the desperate, panicked volleys of militia, but measured, rhythmic, kinetic delivery designed for target acquisition and immediate incapacitation. The veterans, defending the father who stood as their anchor, had established interlocking fields of fire across the high ground, creating a kill zone that was both invisible and inescapable. The initial hours of the engagement dismantled the posse's psychological foundation. Their advance guard, 33 men strong, entered the valley with bugles blaring, signaling their absolute certainty of victory. They were neutralized within 9 minutes. There was no chaotic retreat, no prolonged firefight. There was simply silence following a sharp, devastating exchange of ordnance. Autopsy reports later compiled, though often buried or dismissed as Reconstruction propaganda, consistently suggested surgical efficiency. The targets were neutralized with an economy of movement and ammunition that bespoke long, painful years of experience in organized warfare. This was not frontier justice. This was military interdiction. The immediate realization that their overwhelming numerical advantage had evaporated, replaced by an absolute disparity of tactical power, sent a corrosive wave of fear through the remaining posse leadership. They had been the hunters, using the vacuum of jurisdiction to prey on the weak. Now they were undeniably the prey, trapped in a wilderness that suddenly felt sentient and hostile. We are left with fragments of evidence from that night, artifacts that speak volumes about the moment certainty curdled into primal dread. Years later, deep in the mud of a dried creek bed near where the posse command post was established, investigators found a small, leather-bound diary belonging to a junior captain named Hollis. The final entry, scrawled hastily in the dark, ends mid-sentence. "They do not fight like men, but like..." The word remains unfinished. This profound realization, that the force opposing them transcended typical human resistance and operated on a level of discipline they could not comprehend, was the true pivot point of the conflict. The hunters recognized they were facing an anomaly. This depth of historical analysis, the meticulous forensic examination of the psychological and tactical collapse of these frontier systems of oppression, is rarely sanctioned or preserved. Most history books prefer the cleaner narratives of political shifts and grand battles. But to understand the true dark mechanics of the Reconstruction era, we must study these micro-events, these moments where the corrupt infrastructure failed spectacularly. If you have the constitution for the truth that was deliberately erased from the official record, the quiet, brutal justice exacted by those who refuse to break, then I encourage you to subscribe and continue this investigation into the forgotten chapters of American history. The remainder of the engagement was less a battle and more a systematic deconstruction. The veterans, under the disciplined command of the father, a man whose identity remained largely protected by their loyalty, did not simply hold the line. They prosecuted a campaign of psychological warfare. Using the dense topography and the cloak of night, they performed sustained interdiction on supply lines, neutralized scouting parties without a sound, and created the illusion of ubiquity. Every shadow felt like an executioner. By dawn, the Iron Brigade was fracturing. The chain of command, reliant on arrogance and fear, disintegrated when real danger arrived. The veterans allowed small, panicked groups to flee, knowing that these survivors would carry the plague of terror back to the settlements, ensuring the systemic collapse of the posse's authority. The climax arrived not with a heroic charge, but with a silent, necessary expurgation. The core leadership of the Iron Brigade, 3 key instigators who were responsible for the torture and dispossession of dozens of families, were successfully isolated. They were cornered in a deserted sawmill, believing they had finally found sanctuary. The assault was carried out by a small detachment, perhaps only 12 men, who moved with the devastating precision of highly specialized assassins. The operation was conducted with what can only be described as zero collateral damage. There was no indiscriminate firing. It was a targeted clinical dismantling. The 3 targets were neutralized with concentrated short-range kinetic delivery, incapacitating them before they could even draw their sidearms. The action took less than 60 seconds from the moment of entry to full withdrawal. The message was clear. This was not revenge. This was a judicial correction executed outside the bounds of a failed legal system. The removal of the 3 ringleaders was the final, devastating blow to the Iron Brigade's operational capability. With their financial and strategic heads gone, the militia dissolved into frightened, disorganized bushwhackers, permanently eliminating the organized threat to the region. The aftermath was characterized by an unsettling silence. The 100 veterans, their duty discharged, disappeared back into the fabric of the frontier, just as quickly and mysteriously as they had appeared. They left behind only the evidence of their efficiency, abandoned equipment, tactically sound positions, and the cold, hard proof that organized oppression could be crushed if met with superior organization and moral clarity. The power vacuum that followed the 1869 response was profound. The local authorities, terrified and unwilling to admit the extent of the posse's corruption or the lethality of the veterans' defense, quickly erased the official record. They labeled the event a regrettable localized disturbance, or attributed the deaths to internal feuding. The story of the father and the 100 veterans was too inconvenient, too potent a blueprint for effective rebellion against tyranny. It demonstrated that even in the utter legal chaos of the Reconstruction, true justice, when delivered with professional force, could circumvent the systems designed to protect the corrupt. This event became a phantom history, passed down through whispers and cautious anecdotes around campfires, a legend written not by the official victors who controlled the newspapers, but by the survivors who inherited a fragile, hard-won peace. The lesson was simple yet terrifyingly effective. When an oppressive system believes its control is absolute, the most effective response is not resistance, but total, immediate neutralization executed by an organized force with nothing left to lose. The father, whose defense triggered this kinetic shift, returned to his home, never again harassed. The landscape of the South Fork was forever changed. The Iron Brigade ceased to be a functioning entity, its members either fleeing the state or quietly surrendering their arms. What occurred in that remote valley was a rare moment where the power of moral righteousness, bolstered by expert military training, shattered the infrastructure of terror. The establishment ensures that history is written by the victors, reinforcing the narratives of state power and control. But as the records prove, and as the enduring silence of that valley attests, the legends that truly change the world are the ones written in blood and silence by the survivors. And sometimes the most enduring legend is simply the memory of a father protected by 100 disciplined veterans who refused to let an era's corruption stand unchallenged.